All right. Well, welcome once again to one of our panel discussions slash workshop. I'm really glad that you're with us. Whether you're watching this in real time or watching this later, really hope that the information and the conversation that happens here is encouraging and informative, but most of all, gives you some practical steps for walking out your faith and life in a really positive and proactive way. So my name's Nate. I'm one of the pastors here at Grace. And as we get started, I think I'm just going to open us up with a brief prayer. Heavenly Father, we're kind of in awe of the time that we find ourselves in. And we know that you have brought us here to be a part of your kingdom coming in the midst of pain and discomfort and disruption and injustice and death and sadness and sickness and grief. We pray, God, that you would help us be your hands and feet, to be your voice, to be your loving arms in the lives of our friends and our family and our community. And Lord, we pray that tonight would be an opportunity for us to learn and to grow and to draw closer to you. So we invite your presence here, and we pray all of these things in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. So as I said, my name's Nate, one of the pastors at Grace, and I'm really just serving as the moderator or host of this gathering. We have some great panelists who are going to bring all the information. So the less I talk, the better. Why don't I give the panelists an opportunity to each introduce yourselves and maybe just give us a little bit of your background or your history.
Amy.
All you,
Everybody
Amy.
at once. Hi, everyone. We're glad you're joining us tonight. I'm Amy Breza. I'm one of the children's directors with Grace Church. That brought me to this discussion here, but I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. So I've practiced in therapy since 2008. I began working with young children, so really as young as age 3, and early on worked with children and adolescents and with their families, and then I had family of my own, so kind of took a step back from that, and then God led me into ministry, which is where I find myself. But I also, in the past year, returned to providing therapy, mostly with adults, and that's online. So I do video and phone therapy with adults. So in this conversation, to me, I find so powerful to talk about because grief is a reaction to any form of loss, and it's really a common thread, whether you're 3 years old or you're in your 80s. It's something that everyone's going to experience at some point in their life.
And my name is Alex Pattenaude. I am currently at Eastern Michigan University studying clinical mental health counseling. I currently meet with clients out of the clinic at Eastern Michigan University, and I am very interested in grief, how people process grief, and how understanding that grief is more than coping with loss. It's actually learning how to cope with change that grief often brings to one's life. So I'm just excited to be here tonight and to participate in this conversation.
Hey everyone, glad you're here. My name is Courtney Young, and I am actually in sunny California right now, so you can all be jealous. Heard it's hot out there in Michigan, but I was part of the Grace family for a number of years when my husband and I moved to Michigan, and still part of the Grace family. Thankful to be here tonight. I am not studying or have any desire to know anything about grief, but I am a recipient and have just dealt with grief in my life in a number of ways, which I can share more as we talk further. But one of the big things that I have learned is just how important it is to share what you're going through with others and to share your grief. And so I'm hoping to be able to do that a little bit tonight and encourage you. And I'm also part of a church here in San Diego. I've been in ministry for the last 13 years. So Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. So I think to get us started, we're talking about grief, and I think, Amy, you just said that grief is a response, right, to loss, and Alex, you said it's a response to change. Can we talk a little bit more about what that loss and what that change looks like, or what some of those things might be? I think we often think of grief as like, well, someone passed away, but it's a lot broader than that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, Nate, everyone tends to think about the death of a loved one or a pet, or, our mind definitely goes to death, but really it's any perceived loss. So it could be the loss of a job, or any loss of relationships in your life. Maybe it's a marriage ending, or your parents getting divorced. Like those are all perceived losses. It could be a diagnosis, or watching a loved one in your life go through physical pain or ailment. Just kind of the loss of expected hopes and dreams. It really covers a lot.
Yeah, and I'll just speak into that a little bit. I think sometimes it's easy to write off what you're experiencing as, oh, this is just, why am I weak? Because I feel this in myself. I feel this grief. Actually, one of the best things you can do is understand that, it's more than just how you're experiencing something. It's also how you're processing through something. So Amy just covered a bunch of different things that can happen that cause grief. And I remember in my own life, it was moving from California to Michigan and being away from family, and thinking that the first couple of months of that, oh my gosh, why do I feel this way? And what's wrong with me? Like, shouldn't I be getting past this? But in reality, it was learning it's much more of me needing to engage with the process of understanding that things had changed, and I needed to come to that fact.
And Courtney, this might be a reasonable spot for you to maybe share some of your personal story if you felt comfortable.
Yeah, happy to. One thing I'll touch on that Amy mentioned was anticipated or expectant. So something that you were hoping to have come to fruition that you now know is not going to do that. So I think in light of what the country has dealt with this year with COVID, and even just with some of the racial tension that's gone on, I had to grieve the loss of what 2020 was going to be for me. 2020 was in my mind going to be just a celebratory year based on what I just went through. And even something like that, I have to grieve the plans that are not going to play out the way that they did. So I think that's probably relatable for a majority of us. But just to share a little bit, my experience with grief, my dad was diagnosed with cancer years ago, and ended up passing away at the age, he was 48 at the time, and I was 25 at the time. So losing my dad at a fairly young age. I got married that same year, and my dad passed away 10 days after we got married. So I experienced such great excitement in gaining a husband, but I lost a father in literally a matter of days. And so that created some real tension for our first year of marriage, because I didn't know how to grieve. I didn't know how to grieve in a healthy way. And so I would isolate and try and do things on my own, or manage my own grief, determine when I wanted to grieve, which didn't end very well for me. And so went to counseling, and, still working through learning what those healthy tools are. And then fast forward, my husband and I have been trying to start a family, and it's been 6 years in the making so far. We're on pause right now for a number of reasons, but we're grieving the loss that we may not get to have a family of our own, or get to expand our family. And any baby shower or birthday party with kids I go to, there's a little bit of sting there. There's a little bit of pain there, knowing that, man, I would love to be in this person's shoes, or I would love to be able to bring my child to this birthday party. And then lastly, the most recent one is grieving a diagnosis. So dealing with a major health issue, which was finding out a year ago that I had cancer at age 34, which was not ever on my to-do list. This was on my do not list, things to avoid. And so dealing with that diagnosis, finding out I had stage 4 cancer, chemotherapy for 6 months, and I am thankfully in remission as of September of last year, but I am still grieving that season. I'm grieving that cancer and that diagnosis changed my outlook on life in a lot of really great ways, but I look at life differently now. So just to give you guys a little snapshot of what God and I have been walking through over the years as I deal with just hardship and that pain.
Thanks, Courtney. You know, I think it's an interesting thing to talk about anticipatory grief, because you're grieving something that didn't actually even happen. And I can imagine that somebody would feel, or perhaps would hear, like, just, you shouldn't feel that way. I mean, what do you say to someone like that who's grieving hopes deferred or something like that?
Well, I think it's important to validate their feelings in that moment, that they're anticipating something that, you know, that, like Alex talked about, it's a change. They're grieving that change, and it's still a loss. So validating their feelings in that moment. We don't just even see that with diagnoses. I mean, there's many parents that are worried about what's going to happen with school in the fall. You know, like they're already anticipating, you know, the grief of, do I have to quit my job to stay home with my child and teach them? Do I, you know, how is this going to alter our life, and how will we begin to accept that change? We also see it where, you know, people's parents may be going through dementia or Alzheimer's, because, you know, that individual in their life is changing. And so they begin grieving that before, you know, before any death has occurred.
I'll give there's a tidbit. There's a selfish reason for me asking that, because in honesty, in some ways, I find myself grieving the end of quarantine. I'm an introvert. I get living at home on the farm has been amazing for me. And as I think about returning to the life before, there's an element of grief, and I feel like I shouldn't feel that way. Like, if the world is getting better and if it's safe for me to return back, I should be happy. But it's affirming to know that, no, like, there's a change and a loss there, that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to grieve those things. What I've heard the three of you say is that grief is very individual and can look very different. Could we maybe talk a little bit about what grief looks like?
So I can speak a little bit to just how it has felt for me in the different seasons that I've been in. Grief can be all-consuming, especially when you're first really leaning into it or feeling it. It can feel intense, it can feel heavy, it can feel exhausting, it can feel hopeless at times, because you have what feels almost just like this dark cloud over your shoulder, and you're wondering, when am I going to feel better? When am I going to move to this new place? And I think, you know, there's obviously the flip side to it. So you're not just going to always feel that way. There is going to come a point where things start to shift. But I think it's important to just, as you're going through that grief, that you're not setting an expectation or a timetable to grief, or you're not going, okay, well, my sister and I both lost our dad, and she seems to be doing a lot better than I am, so I'm probably not grieving well enough, or I'm being too sensitive, when in reality, her grief experience is going to look very different from mine. We're different people, and we have a different relationship with that person, and just focusing not on what somebody else's experience is, or what you think your grief journey should look like. Oh, well, it's been 6 months. I should be in a better place now. There's not a checklist or a schedule that you can refer to for us type A people. I would love if there were, but it is a journey, and you will keep moving forward in it. And it does get easier, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, that's well said, Courtney. Something when I'm meeting with somebody who is experiencing lots of grief, and it's just helpful for them to know that it's okay if it feels like it's unbearable and it's really hard, and they're frustrated because it's hanging around. Something I show them often is like a little visual. So this is how we want grief to work, point A to point B, but it's so much more crazy. Grief really acts like this, right? Where something happens and it's just insane, and it's not linear. You can't put a timetable on it. You can't say the perfect thing that's going to fix it. What you need to do is you need to acknowledge it.
So
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to point out, Courtney had said earlier that in the beginning, there may have been some unhealthy ways of coping with that grief too. And I think it's important to note that there's no right or wrong way to grieve. Like it's not right or wrong, but there can be healthy versus unhealthy ways of interacting with that grief. So I think that's important to note.
That's something that I would love to I'd love to follow up on, and I think we'll get to like how we process grief in just a minute. But I remember seeing some of the notes, Amy and Alex, that you put together, and there's a whole laundry list of ways that people experience grief. Amy, would you mind just listing some of those off to give us an idea?
Yeah, so in the beginning, maybe shock, denial, sadness, intense feelings of being overwhelmed, beginning to have lots of questions, or questioning if things will ever change or the purpose of life, difficulty sleeping. There could be physical somatic symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, just body pain in general. Appetite may change, whether more or less, maybe fatigue, or just feeling completely overwhelmed and consumed by that, or difficulty concentrating is a big one, or being able to focus on tasks.
I just wanted to mention before we go any further that if you have questions and you can type them in the chat, or there is a Q&A feature to this webinar, and we will try to answer those questions in real time. If something feels like it's a great question, but it's a little bit outside the flow of the conversation, we will take time at the end to come back and address it again. So if you have a question, just type it in, and we'll try to grab it. So I know panelists, at least Amy and Alex, that I asked this question as we were prepping this, but some of those things that you list, Amy, how do we begin to know if that's grief, or if it's just sadness, or if it's anxiety that's unrelated? Like, how do we begin, Alex, if it looks like this, how do we begin to untangle that or understand it?
Yeah, so I think a huge part of this is just understanding that grief can act as an activating event to other things like increased anxiety, increased depression. There's actually something that's called complicated grief. And with complicated grief, it's, for example, you have a death of a close one by you, or someone who's close to you, and that death acts as a wound. But underneath that wound, there's an infection. Maybe you wish you could have been close to that person. Maybe you wish that you could have forgiven that person before they passed away. And so grief can be extremely complicated, and realizing, Nate, to your question, is that there's a lot of crossover with emotions, with, there's a fancy word for it called comorbidity, where there's a lot of things that can come into play that can arise because of the wound that grief creates. So I don't know if Amy or Courtney kind of want to speak more to that.
Yeah, I think it's also someone who has experienced anxiety or major depressive disorder in the past. They may have a higher risk. So, for instance, when they're experiencing grief, they're going to recognize that feeling of depression that they have had in the past, but it may be more intensified for them. So it's important for them to immediately go to some of those coping skills or support systems they've used in the past. Whereas someone who is experiencing what they describe as depression or overwhelming sadness, strictly just related to the grief that they're going through, they're just going to look a little bit different. So that might, it'll just look a little more intensified, I would say, for those who have a diagnosis of depression.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to it, each person's symptoms could look very differently. And we've touched on that, but, for me, if I'm you know, Amy mentioned if you have experienced it in the past, like I have a much better understanding of grief now because I'm like, oh, grief, got this. Okay, did this in 2010, I'll do it again. So I'm able to understand what my triggers are more common, and I'm able to get to that place quicker of going, okay, I'm feeling a tightness in my chest, or I can't stop crying when I see this commercial. Okay, what, you know, it's identifying that there's something underlying, and having the discipline of just kind of leaning into that a little bit more and going, okay, why am I feeling that way? Okay, well, that commercial makes me sad. Okay, well, why does it make me sad? Well, it's because it's about a dad and her daughter. Okay, so then is it making me think of this? And it's kind of asking those questions, and that takes time to get to that place, but you can start with simply just trying to identify, okay, I'm feeling this emotion. Where might that be coming from? And a lot of times, you know, there is an underlying feeling that you need to kind of lean into.
So, Amy, I was in the midst of addressing some questions in the chat while you were talking about what grief might look like. Did you talk about how it might look differently for children than for adults? Did I miss that?
Not yet, but I'm happy to cover that. Because yeah, like I mentioned earlier, even I mean, infants can experience grief, and you know, it's interesting. It definitely looks different in children, so it might be helpful for me to just go through what may look different at each developmental stage. For instance, with infants, birth to 2 years, they have no understanding of death, but they can pick up on the absence of a parent or a primary caregiver who has passed, or sudden changes that are impacting their caregivers. They're picking up on the emotions and feelings there. So even an infant or a 2-year-old could have increased tearfulness or difficulty sleeping because there's a loss or a sudden change in their home. Preschoolers, ages about 3 to 6, they're going to become, when it's specific to death, they're going to be more curious about that death, but they also tend to carry this magical thinking. So they think that it may be temporary or reversible. We experienced that in our home during quarantine. Our dog, who is almost 12 years old, did die, and we have an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old. And so our 8-year-old was processing this so much more differently than our 3-year-old, who our 3-year-old would say, like, you know, Izzy said she's going to start breathing again. You know, it's like she had this magical thinking that she would come back, and that we just needed to give it a couple of days and she would be back again. When it comes to school-age children, like 6 to 12 years old, they understand that death is final, and then they begin to understand around age 10, they fully understand that it happens to everyone, and that it really can't be avoided. And so they're going to have more specific questions about death, like what happens to the body, what happens after someone dies. They're just going to ask more questions about it. However, they're also more likely to struggle communicating their feelings surrounding it. Again, with back to the example of our dog, you know, our 8-year-old, she wanted to know all of the specifics. You know, what happened when you went to the animal hospital? You know, what did she look like, you know, before and after? Like, she wanted all of those details, because that those were questions that she had. Some of the behaviors that you may begin to see, because they have difficulty expressing their feelings, you may see them acting out in other ways, like getting really frustrated with the sibling, or attempting to do a task and getting like kind of blowing up when it doesn't work out properly. It's because that the feelings within them just begin to get displaced into this frustration with other things. So you may see anger show up in that way. Again, our kids, they're especially school age and up through teenagers, they're grieving school ending the way that it ended. They thought they were going to return to being in person if they're in public schools. They thought they were going to return to that and didn't. And you know, graduating seniors, you know, here's teenagers, you know, they had this thought that graduation, going to prom, you know, things like that, they thought they were going to get to have, and they didn't. So how we see teenagers grieve differently is they tend to, specifically when it comes to death, they have and understanding the way an adult would have, but they don't yet have the life experiences or the coping skills to process it in a way that an adult would. So sometimes when you're talking to a teenager, the communicating may be very understanding, like it sounds like they understand, but they're going to react a little bit differently. So they're going to have a wide range of emotions, but they may not be comfortable talking about it, and they're more likely to push away from their parents. So their parents, they're not going to seek talking to their parents about their feelings. They may be more likely to spend time alone or talking to their peers during this stage.
Thanks, Amy. So we've had several questions, people asking about how they can support other people who are in the midst of grief, how we navigate if we see someone dealing with grief in unhealthy ways, and we will get to all of that. But just before we do, I wanted to talk a little bit about the common thing that you hear, the common phrase is stages of grief. I've heard that is not necessarily the most accurate way to think about grief, especially if it's like Alex described and it goes like this. That didn't look like a stage to me. Alex, do you maybe want to talk about stages and if how appropriate they are or not?
Yeah, so I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. It includes denial. So something happens and it's almost like, I can't believe this happened. I can't believe this is happening. And it's hard to kind of come to terms with it. After that, there's anger. Maybe you feel angry towards something that happened in your life. I had a friend whose mom passed away and she was getting married, and she said, Alex, I'm so mad at my mom because my mom isn't going to be with me today. There's bargaining. Sometimes we do this in our prayer life where we're like, God, please just give this back to me because I feel very upset, or I feel very lost, and I need this back. And then there's depression, which is the sensation of just feeling extreme sadness. You might cry during this time. You might feel like you don't belong to a group or to a family, to a friend, because you feel kind of isolated. And then there's acceptance. And acceptance is when you get to that point of, okay, this is the new normal. I understand it's still gonna hurt. And I understand that I'm not gonna feel perfect all the time about this, but I know that I can keep going forward. And I know that I can keep experiencing this and learning from this experience. One of the reasons why this model gets flack sometimes is because you say you say stages and you think, okay, well, this means I'm going to go from denial to anger, and then anger to bargaining, and it's just going to be healthy and strong. As I go through this, I'm going to find healing. But in reality, it's more like a staircase where the bottom of the stairs might be denial, middle anger, a little higher bargaining. And you might fluctuate frequently between those stages. Like that friend who had a mom passed away. She's been in acceptance for quite some time, but on her wedding day, she ended up back in anger. And so just being aware that that staircase is there, and also being aware that whatever staircase you're on, God will definitely meet you. He's not ashamed of you if you're experiencing different feelings from the grief you have in your life.
Courtney, how does that ring true with some of your own personal experience?
It's interesting, as I was listening and reading through them, there are certain stages that I don't stay in for very long at all. So anger, and it's dependent on the person. So anger is not something that I experience time and time again. I deal more with the depression. So for me, grief looks like sadness. It looks really reflective, and so there's certain ones that I not necessarily skip, but I just don't spend as much time on. And I think it also depends on the type of loss. If it's dealing with the loss of a loved one, you might lean into that anger a little bit more. I mean, I do remember being angry at God when after my dad passed, and I was in a worship service, and I remember seeing everybody else worshiping and they looked so joyful. And I was thinking, how can anybody be happy right now. Like, I lost my dad, and he's never coming, like, I'm never going to see him again here on this earth. And that was an anger that I had, you know, that moment that I had to work through with God, and it took some time. But I think, just to wrap up, that not everyone is going to resonate with you as much. And it's just important I have learned tools on how to deal with my depression when I'm dealing with grief. And so it's learning what you respond best to, and pulling out those tools when you need it.
Thanks, Courtney. You know, and just touching on something that you said, we had someone ask about sort of the biblical framework for grief. And I think you talking about processing anger and grief with God, I think, is a good step into that. Do any of you have thoughts about how the Bible tells us to do it, or what the Bible has to say?
Yeah, one verse that stands out to me, it's in 2 Corinthians 1:3-4, and it says, "Praise be to God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort." And this specific verse really stands out. So, God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. And what I take from that is that God is going to give us that comfort, like nobody else can. But the beautiful part about it is that God gives us that comfort, and then he equips us and allows us to experience that comfort so that we can go and comfort other people. So just as we're doing on this call and all sharing our experiences, there might be something that is helpful for you, or something that brings you comfort. And that, to me, is just a extension of what God has already promised us. So that's been really helpful for me in those moments of pain and loss, when I'm like, God, what is this for? Like, why do I have to go through this? And that's not necessarily the best question to ask, but what he's been showing me is, one, that he's there, he's my ultimate comforter, but also that he has used my pain to help other people, and that brings me peace and brings me comfort again. So it's a full circle.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard someone speak one time on grief and how what a model looked like, and they used David as an example, and I really enjoyed it because you read Psalm and David dives into his pain. He doesn't deny it, and he fully admits to what he's feeling, and so I think just knowing, like, if for the biblical model, is that it's often being honest, right? And then the second thing is, I think, holding the tension with understanding that it's not always going to get better right away, but continuing to bring it to God. Don't just, bring it to God once and put it on a shelf. Bring it to God over and over again if it keeps hurting. And then the third part of that, I think, is the fact that when we continue to do this, we see opportunities for God to move in the new that he gives us in those moments, through us growing and experiencing growth through our relationship with God.
What would you say to somebody that is kind of in the spot of feeling like, look, if all things work together for good for those that love God, then shouldn't I just be able to get past this? Shouldn't I be able to see the good in it? Or shouldn't I be able to just kind of put my hope in Jesus and not feel this way anymore?
That's a tough one. I'm thinking on it. My perspective on it is that we live in a fallen world, that we live in a world of sin and pain, and this is not how God intended for it to be. And he will use these things for good, but that doesn't mean that we don't feel along the way. We need to feel so that we can experience joy, and we need to feel the sadness so that we can grieve, or that we can care for another person. So I don't think being in a place where, like, man, I mean, and I've beat myself up at times going, why can't I just trust him more? Why can't I move forward in this? And I just go back to, and I know it's a broken record, but it's just, this is part of my journey. This is something that God and I are going through. And he's right by my side and moving me forward in this, but it's okay that I'm going to be sad. It's okay that I'm going to experience pain. He's with me. It's how I do it and how I work through it. Like Amy mentioned, there are healthy ways and unhealthy ways to do it. So if I am just going to my cookie dough every night and trying to just eat my sorrows away, sure, I can do that. But I don't think that's going to quite get me where I want to be, versus if I go and I journal and I talk to God and I release things to him. So might be a little long-winded, but that, to me, this is part of our journey with God.
I just had one thing to add to that. So last week in my daily devotional, I had to pull it out because it was perfect timing. It said, grief is good when it mourns what God hates, but it's dangerous when it questions God's goodness and love. And I think just tying back into what Courtney was saying, like, we live in a fallen world and there's brokenness in our world. And, God does not love, the hate and the pain and the suffering that we're going through. So when we're grieving, we're mourning in a sense of what God hates. Like, that's not what he had intended for us all along from the beginning. And so really leaning into like seeing God's goodness and seeing God's love, and that the change that we go through can draw us closer to him as well and be in his presence.
I was trying to look up a verse as well, but there's a verse in the Old Testament where God says to the Israelites, essentially, he says, like, how I longed to gather you like a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you would have none of it. I mean, there's God grieves as well. And so for us to be experiencing that is not in any way antithetical to the gospel or antithetical to the truth of Jesus. Even God grieves, but Jesus did come to bring eventually restoration. And I kind of want to shift our conversation to begin to talk about, okay, so we've experienced a loss of some sort. We are beginning to grieve. How do we begin to process that? What do we do?
So I think, once again, every person's going to be different in that. I'll share some practical things that have been helpful for me, and there's dozens of things that that might work for you. I already mentioned, don't compare your grief timeline to others. Focus on your journey in that. Another big one that I learned early on was don't isolate. And it's so easy to do that when you're experiencing those different stages, but share with others. Don't do it alone. God created us for community. So it's important, even for me, when I was early in our marriage, I would hide my grief from Brandon because I wanted to be this happy bride for him. Like, we just got married. I don't want him coming home every day and I'm bawling. But by me withholding that from him, it didn't allow him to walk through that with me and to learn what I needed, or to learn how to encourage me or to pray for me. And so I had to learn over time that I needed to share that with him. And now, years later, we've had other forms of grief that have gone on in our lives, and we are quicker to be able to support each other because of us walking through it together early on in our marriage. And then I think another one would be, as hard as it is, lean into it, feel it. The more you feel it, I find that the sooner I'm able to take a step forward. If I stuff it for weeks on end, it's just lingering. I'm not addressing it. And so I can't move forward. And so sometimes I'm feeling it for a couple days and I'm like, I will get to it on Saturday when I have when I have the time and the space for it. But don't run away from it, because you're going to have to address it at some point.
That's good. Thanks, Courtney. How about some other first steps, Amy, Alex?
Yeah, I think going back to validating your loss and recognizing that that it is something significant in your life that you lost, even if it, it may, like Nate, coming out of quarantine, it may seem like a small thing to some, but that's a big thing for you. And so validating that and saying, this is a loss that I'm experiencing, and some people may understand, some people may not, but for me, that's a significant loss. And so validating that loss, sometimes it is having a support system who can help validate that with you. That's why grief groups are created, because they can bring like-minded experiences and people together to be able to share that with a group that's going to support them and validate them. Oftentimes we can find that with our partners and loved ones, or in small groups, but just initially beginning to validate that. And I think another thing is making sure that you're doing the things that you enjoy, because that's one thing that you'll start to lose in the grieving process, is that the things that once brought you joy may not bring you joy anymore. And so just know that's just for now, kind of push it a little bit, like try to go for that walk again, or try to read a book if you're able to focus on it. Whatever it is that you may enjoy doing, like take a step towards doing it. You may not be able to do it that day, but you might be able to tomorrow or a week from now. So keep trying to take those steps. And then also self-care. Just like, we saw this in sheltering in the beginning, right? Like people are like, I've gone a week and haven't showered, like they were grieving this, loss of routine. And so, it's imagine how much you'll feel better just by doing this regular self-care and knowing that, like, you have to eat. You're grieving, but you need to eat and you need to, do those things. So I think those are especially good for beginning first steps of just making sure that self-care is there and validate your loss.
Yeah, and there's something at the end of what Courtney said that I think is profoundly powerful, and that's the idea of engaging with your grief. And I call it proactively engaging with your grief. And I say that because fear can be such an obstacle when dealing with grief. Fear of the emotions that you'll feel, fear of what stage you'll be in, fear of, how you're going to respond to your grief. And I think acknowledging that, you proactively engaging and picking up your grief and actually spending time with it can be very helpful for that healing process. And I just want to add on to what Amy said with the self-care. I think self-compassion is a huge part of overcoming your grief. And we kind of touched on it earlier, Nate, when you asked, what are all the different things you can experience with grief? Well, part of knowing what you're experiencing comes from self-care or self-compassion, because it's being mindful. It's taking time to say those questions that are really important. What am I feeling right now? Could I describe this feeling? Could I possibly try to share it with somebody else to process through what I'm feeling right now? And as you do that, you proactively engage with grief, and you maybe even find the underlying things like anxiety or increased depression that can ultimately help you tackle your grief at a quicker rate than kind of stuffing it down because of that fear you have and not picking it up and actually interacting with it.
So it sounds like you've all said something along the lines of we're walking a line between being okay with the feelings and kind of affirming them, but also in some ways being proactive when it comes to self-care and doing things you enjoy. How do we know that what side we're on? Courtney, you mentioned unhealthy ways of processing grief. Can you help us? Can you guys help us understand a little bit where we might? I know that line is different for everybody, but how do we begin to sense where that line between healthy and unhealthy, or proactive and reactive, exists?
For me, it's taken time to figure that out. So, as Alex was saying, like that, I can't remember the phrase he uses, but essentially like self, like looking at yourself in a sense. If I am experiencing, sadness, or, and it's lasting for, 3, 4, 5 days, and it's something that's lower level, so not the loss of a loved one, but maybe I made a mistake at work, and I'm for days just beating myself up over it, or or questioning, if I'm gonna, the thought process can go negative pretty quickly. If I'm doing that for an extended period of time and I'm not making progress forward, that's usually an indicator for me that I need to either lean into a little bit more, or I am just, I am stagnant. and I'm not really addressing it. So, you know, it's going to look different. Like I said, the timetable is different for everyone, but I'll do something that I know is self-care for me. So going for a walk is usually very helpful for me. It clears my head, or maybe it's listening to worship music and journaling. When I find myself doing those things and I make progress, that helps me know that I'm, you know, that I'm no longer sitting in it, but there is a balance. It's gonna look different. I'm sure, you know, Alex and Amy might have some tools from the, you know, from a professional side of it, but it's learning yourself, and it's learning that balance of how long I'm going to feel. And a lot of times for me, it's isolating. So if I'm isolating for too long and I'm not saying it out loud, or I'm not talking to someone about it, then I'm just spinning in lies from the enemy. And so that's a big piece of it too.
I think it's also important to look at what's normal in grief, and as it starts leaning towards unhealthy or even dangerous or destructive behaviors, that's when it's less of trying to lean into it on your own and more of seeking the support systems to help you navigate that grief. For instance, if someone is so angry that they're becoming destructive to property, or, you know, verbally abusing family or friends, or maybe taking out their anger at the grocery clerk, you know, like that's something to take a little more considerate. Like, that's moving towards unhealthy levels of grieving, that they could really benefit from having a therapist. If the thoughts of depression, the thoughts during depression are moving towards, like, I no longer want to live, you know, that hopelessness of just, there's nothing left here for me now that my loved one's gone. Those are also things that suggest that, you know, it's probably time to seek emergency services at that time, and, you know, immediately reach out to a therapist, or even, you know, if there's a plan of hurting yourself in place, like reaching out to emergency care immediately. So there definitely is this line of what's normal and healthy versus what's moving towards unhealthy, destructive, or so prolonged that the grief becomes complicated. Like, are they at risk at losing their job because of routinely, you know, repeatedly calling into work? You know, beginning to look at some of those identifiers as, you know, is now there a substance abuse issue, or, you know, other things, other coping skills that that maybe seemed normal in the beginning have now become a problem. So that's something to consider as well.
I just want to, one of the attendees asked this question, saying that the depression within the grief makes it so exhausting to choose to be vulnerable, or to muster the energy to do the care. Kind of like, is there a line? How do you navigate between saying, like, look, this is exhausting, I just need to rest in this, or I need to push forward? How do we find that line? It's a hard question.
I do think it's important to recognize that, yeah, it is exhausting, and it's hard to get out of bed when you're grieving, and it's hard to, you know, do the next responsible thing. And there's some days that maybe you do just need to stay in bed that day, or, you know, allow someone else in your life to step in and take care of the responsibilities that you know, other people can pick up. That's okay. Also knowing of at what point is it, you know, now becoming dangerous. Maybe there's more days where you're not getting out of bed than you are getting out of bed. You know, that would be something that would suggest that maybe you're stuck in how you're processing your grief. But yeah, there's certainly going to be days that you're like, wow, I've made it 5 days. You know, I'm up, I'm out, I'm doing things. And then a day hits and you're like, I don't want to get out of bed today. That's still normal grieving. You know, it's normal to experience that.
Oh, go ahead, Courtney.
Sorry, just to add to what Amy said, completely agree. There are days when you're just going to need to rest, or to to process. And I would say, if by the end of that day or that weekend, if you're feeling worse than you were when you started, I think that's another way to look at it too. So if you're like, man, I just need a day to not talk about it, you know, when you go through your day, you'll get a sense of whether or not like that was beneficial for you. Was it beneficial to just stay in bed and to veg and to cry and to, you know, watch your favorite show, or are you feeling worse? Are you feeling worse because of it? So some of it you're going to assess as you go. And sometimes you'll be like, oh man, I tried to go out and hang out with friends and that actually just backfired. And you'll know that for the next time. You'll get a sense of what you're needing. And it just takes time.
That's a really helpful clarification, Courtney. We have a question in a similar vein. You know, how do you navigate if it's still okay to be tired, or if it's still okay to be having trouble focusing on work a month later? The question I think is that people are asking is, how do I know if I'm okay in processing my grief?
I mean, normal grief can last at least for a couple of years even. I mean, within a month, you're still in your early stages of grieving, following the death of a loved one. So yeah, that's definitely still normal.
I just want to add to that. I think it is normal, and I think it's important to note that you don't want to walk away from this conversation thinking that I need to do X, Y, and Z to fix myself, because that's going to be more destructive than helpful. But something that could be helpful maybe is even seeing like a counselor, seeing a therapist, because there could be underlining factors there that you are necessarily you're not aware of. You could be unaware to something that could be making it extremely painful, even more painful for you as an individual. So I just want to share that it's okay that you're experiencing that, and then echo what Amy said, and maybe try to explore if there's something deeper there that would be helpful to uncover.
I think one of the benefits of what you're saying, Alex, is also that a therapist can provide like third-party observation. If we get really mixed up in what we're feeling, it can be really hard to know if it's better or worse than it was last week or a month ago. And a neutral third party can be invaluable in terms of saying, you know what, you may feel awful, but I want you to know that a month ago you would have said this to me and this to me, and you didn't this time, and that's progress. So I think there's a lot to be said for finding someone that can walk with you through your grief, whether that's if you have a spouse or someone who is equipped. But also, man, there's a lot of professionals who are very, very good at what they do. And we do have a list of resources available. If you wanted to begin reaching out to therapists, we'll be happy to provide that. But that's definitely a step that a lot of people find valuable.
Yeah, just to go off of that, Nate, I had a friend one time who lost their dog, and it was just a really hard event for them, and they were an adult. And they were frustrated, but they went to that third party, and that third party uncovered a feeling of, they always feel like at the end of the day they're alone. And it wasn't until they touched on, oh my goodness, there's been this feeling that's in the back of my mind. At the end of the day, I always feel I'm alone. It wasn't until they touched that feeling where they're like, okay, now I can actually explore what it looks like to say goodbye to my dog, which I thought was a very powerful experience for them.
There have been quite a few questions from people asking, how do we support others who are going through grief? In fact, one of the questions was, how do we support people who are grieving but might not even know they're grieving? Or how do we support people who are grieving in really unhealthy ways? Can the panel speak to some of those situations?
Absolutely. So I think some very simple things you can do is just checking in on them, asking them how you're doing, reassuring them that you're here to support them. Obviously, this is if someone is acknowledging that they're in a tough spot or they need support. For those that maybe aren't as aware that they might be in a grieving place, even just doing more listening and less talking, just letting them share. And then I think a few common phrases that might get a little bit confusing or unhelpful would be trying to avoid saying things that are going to lessen how they're feeling. So Amy's talked about it quite a bit, like validating the feelings that you're having. And so if you're dealing with someone that's experienced loss, saying something, and if you've said this, that's okay. I've said many of these things and learned from it, but saying, oh, well, at least they're in a better place now. That may be true, but at the same time, that person right now is experiencing loss and wishing this person were here with them. And so that can be somewhat hurtful at times, or, oh, well, at least the cancer's gone now. It almost discredits the pain that you've gone through, or the hurt that you've had along the way. So I think focusing on things that are a little bit more neutral by just saying, man, I'm so sorry for what you're going through, or gosh, that must be so hard, or I'm here for you, I'm praying for you, if there's anything you need. You're not focused, you're saying very general things that can translate to a lot of different areas that people may be experiencing, but you're just acknowledging, you're validating, and you are letting them know, like Alex said, that they're not alone in this, that they have a support in you.
I think adding to what Courtney said, she mentioned the at least, and they're in a better place now, but there's other platitudes like your loved one wouldn't want you to be sad. So then that leaves that person maybe feeling some guilt and shame about the feeling that they're having, or looking almost too far ahead, saying this experience is going to make you stronger. So again, it puts a lot of pressure on the person to make meaning of their loss too suddenly for what they're going through. The other thing that Courtney mentioned is offering help. And if it's a sudden loss for someone, it's actually more helpful for you to offer very specific things. So when you're offering, you're doing it in an active way, saying, hey, tomorrow I'm going to the store. I'd like to drop off groceries. Can I bring you ABC? Like being very specific in how you plan on offering, or saying, in 2 days, I don't have to work. I'd like to come over and do your laundry. Those very specific things that could be an action that you could do for them, because in those, I want to say early stages, but even, a month or so after, there are times that even just doing simple tasks are hard. And so having someone to step in and saying, I'm dropping off a meal at your house, or I'm bringing you groceries, those are huge to someone who's grieving.
What about the issue of someone who might be grieving or has experienced loss and isn't grieving? What can we do for someone like that?
I think Courtney definitely touched on that a little bit, is reaching out to them, letting them know you care, that if it's someone that you're close to and that you love, like pointing out some of those destructive behaviors that you see. If this is, several months down the road, if that person is receptive to you saying like, hey, I'm concerned for what I'm seeing right now. How can I help you? Can I help you find a therapist? I'm concerned about where you're at in your grief. I think just, yes, opening a listening ear, but also pointing out the concern that you have for them is very important, and maybe helping them take those next steps. Saying, hey, I have this resource that has a list of counselors in our area. Can I help you call some of them and set up your appointment? If they're having trouble seeing it or taking that next step, maybe helping them see what you see and the concern that you have for them.
I think you can also, depending on the relationship you have with them, going back to acknowledging, what they've gone through over the last number of months. So saying, man, gosh, with your husband getting furloughed and with the recent loss of your grandma, like that's a lot that you're going through. Like, how are you dealing with that? And just sometimes even making that acknowledgement allows them to go, you know what, gosh, that is a lot. Or it might open their eyes to realize, like, I have been having a hard time and I didn't even realize that these 5 things were compounding in what's going on in my life right now. So it'll depend on the relationship, but sometimes it's just kind of painting a picture for something that they may not be clearly seeing.
I want to reiterate that if you have any questions, even if it's something that we haven't covered yet, that you'd like us to try to address, we do want to take some time to answer those specifically. So you can type those in either to the chat or to the Q&A. Amy, I wondered again if you could maybe address for how do we support children that are navigating grief?
Yeah, so with young kids, you want to give them the words and terms for what they're going through, like help them to understand their feelings. A great way to do that is through storybooks. There are great storybooks out there that can be specific to the loss in their life. Even when, COVID happened, like immediately there were books being put out of like, this is how you talk about what they're experiencing. Books on divorce or on a child going into foster care, like that loss. There's tons of resources out there for kids. So starting with a book that helps give them the language to understand and normalize their experience, because these books will say, you may be feeling, pain in your stomach or like butterfly feelings, or your head may hurt, or you may have trouble sleeping. And it helps begin to start that conversation with a child of what they're experiencing and why they may be experiencing it. Other important factors is that you're encouraging them to ask questions and that you're responding as prompt and honestly as you can about the loss. For instance, in our home, when our 8-year-old started grieving the loss of school and gymnastics and going to Sunday school, she had a lot of questions, and there are times that we had to say, we don't know. We gave her the information that we had as honestly as possible, but it's also important for parents to be able to say, I don't know, but I'm going to help you find an answer. Or when I do find an answer for you, I'll be sure to keep you in the loop, so that they're a part of not only understanding their grief, but understanding the things that are impacting their grief. Other ways with kids, especially teenagers, we want to look at what we call widening the circle. So as I said before, teenagers are less likely to talk to their feelings with their parents or primary caregivers, but they may be more likely to talk to a trusted student ministry leader or a neighbor or friend or coach, teacher. They may be more likely to communicate with someone else outside of their home. So helping them make those connections so that they can have those conversations would be an important way to help a teenager who's grieving.
Thanks, Amy. Nobody else has chatted in any questions necessarily, but I'm wondering, panelists, if there's anything else that that you we didn't cover before we get to describing some of the resources we have available.
So there's one thing that came to mind that I'm not sure if we've touched on yet, which is a phrase that is commonly used, which is new normal. So learning your new normal. And I learned this after my dad passed away, and even after experiencing cancer and remission, that you have this tendency to want to return back to life the way that it was before the loss or before the pain. And so a common phrase is that you're going to find your new normal, that life that once was is going to look different now, whether it's that loved one that's no longer part of your life, or for me, even just experiencing chemotherapy and knowing that there's the potential that the cancer is going to return again. My life just looks different now. I look at things differently than I used to. And so learning that there's going to be a new normal as you move through these stages of grief, whichever ones you experience. And then also, we've touched on it, but I think just, this is one that I've struggled with, which is giving myself grace to be content in being exactly where I am. I have the natural tendency as an achiever to want to be further along, to want to get through something quicker or lean into the pain so I can move forward. And I've really had to learn to give myself grace and trust that I am right where I'm supposed to be, that God has me right where I'm supposed to be. And so as, some of the questions have been like, how do I know if I'm, if I'm struggling or if I'm not where I'm supposed to be? Yes, absolutely look into resources. And I've done counseling for years over a number of these things, but it's also okay to be content and right where you are.
Any closing thoughts, Amy or Alex?
The only other thing I wanted to add is that being aware, I think Courtney mentioned earlier that there are some triggers to grief. So you may feel like you're at this place of acceptance and, moving along, and then suddenly it hits you out of the blue. And those are some of the triggers to your grief. Some common ones could be an anniversary or a birthday. We see that at Mother's and Father's Days for those who have lost parents, or if someone lost their parent at a young age, when they graduate, if their parent's not there for a graduation or for a wedding, those are things that could be triggers. So almost anticipating that those are going to be a trigger to kind of bolster up a little bit, to like almost prepare yourself for it, and to also let your support system know of like, hey, we're nearing the date that I lost a loved one. I just want you to be aware that this is this may be a trigger for me, so that they're aware. Maybe you need to take the day off of work that day, because that you're going to have a hard time focusing anyways. Like just kind of understanding when some of those triggers might be.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And everyone's going to be different in this, but I try to find things that I can do to be celebratory on those days. And so for me, when it's every year on my dad's birthday, we go and get ice cream because he worked for an ice cream company for 20 plus years of his career. And so we intentionally go out and do that. For Mother's Day is a hard one for me because I yearn to be a mom, and it's where you're not at that stage yet. And so I reach out to my friends that are moms, and I encourage them as moms and what gifts and talents I see them being as moms. And so sometimes it's celebration, but also kind of leaning into that pain a little bit to just honor that you might be in a tough spot, but I want to celebrate those people that I love and that I care for.
In some ways, it almost sounds like you're even saying it's a way of communicating that the pain is okay. That even though the pain is there, that doesn't mean that life stops, or that the things that are good can't still be enjoyed or engaged in. That's powerful.
Yeah.
Alex, did you have any closing thoughts?
No, I just think that one of the best tools you could use for grieving, and Courtney kind of talked about this earlier, is that actively acknowledging that this is what I'm feeling, and then if you're helping someone else, like Amy said too, actively acknowledging and creating that space for that person to cry or to be, whatever they're feeling, and just being there with them, not saying it's okay, it's going to get better, but just saying, I'm here.
Good. Thanks, Alex. So let's talk about resources a little bit. Alex, why don't you tell us some of the stuff we got going on?
Absolutely. So we have a grief group that actually Amy and I will be leading for 4 weeks, starting next week. And it'll go from 7:30 to 8:30. And Nate will be sending out, you'll send that out, correct, Nate? Cool. A link to the panelists. It is going to be capped at 10 people. So if you see it, register as quick as you can. That'd be great. We're also going to provide you with a kind of a little worksheet almost that goes through the Kluver-Ross stages, and it kind of helps you reflect on how you've personally felt in those stages when you realized you were there. And this is really developing a sense of mindfulness, as well as a sense of just understanding for yourself to continue to process through grief, learn how to process through it, and be aware of where you're at when you're experiencing one of the stages of grief. And Amy, I know you had a couple extra resources on there.
Yeah, so there's, if you know a child who is grieving loss locally, there's a place called Ellie's place that specifically works with children. I'm also going to compile some children's books that we can send out as a resource as well. But I would say if anyone hearing this says that there's a very specific loss in their life that they would like for their child, I'm happy to explore resources, additional resources as well.
And as I mentioned, we do, Grace, as a church, we do have a long list of local counselors and therapists. They all come via personal recommendation from somebody. I mean, again, finding a therapist is like a whole separate conversation, but we do have places to get started. And so I'm going to include that in what I send out as well. We forgetting anything in terms of resources?
I think you covered them, Nate.
Okay, I will do my best to get those sent out tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then on Wednesday for sure. Last question that we often get people that want to reach out to a panelist specifically. Panelists, if I get those requests, can I make your email available for follow-up? Okay, all right. So if you hear that, attendees, if you want to reach out to Grace to talk to a panelist, you can do that. For
my email address is Nate.
That's right. All right. Courtney, would you be willing to close us in prayer?
Sure, I'd love to. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for who you are. We thank you that you are our source of comfort, that you bring us comfort when we need it, and that we are able to take that comfort you provided us and share that with others. And I thank you for everyone on this panel. And Lord, I thank you for those on this webinar, God, that are wanting to learn more, whether it's for themselves, whether it's for a loved one, someone that they care about that's going through a hard time. God, we are constantly learning and growing in how we can love others well, how we can come alongside one another. And I just thank you that you created us for community, that we don't have to do this alone, that we have people that we can turn to. So I pray for everyone on the call right now, God, that your Holy Spirit would just provide a sense of peace and comfort. If there's sadness or anger or depression that people may be feeling, Lord, that you would show them the areas where they can lean in more, where they can sit in it, where they can just take steps in their grief journey. And Lord, would you just continue to guide our every step, and God, that you would just come alongside those that are experiencing loss right now. So we love you, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Nate.
Thanks to all our panelists, and thanks again to everybody that was on the call. We did record this, and I'm going to include a link to the recording in the resources. So if you have someone in your life that you think should hear it or couldn't get on the call and wanted to, that'll be available as well. But other than that, enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.